September 23rd, 1997. Federal Plaza, Manhattan, 6:30 in the morning. FBI agents arrested 14 men in a massive heroin bust that netted millions in Asian heroin flooding New York streets. Among those cuffed that morning was a 63-year-old Lucchese soldier named John Campopiano. He asked the judge for heart medicine. The press called him Johnny Echoes. Moviegoers knew him by a different name, Jimmy Two Times. This wasn't some harmless eccentric. This was a wholesale heroin dealer who spent 30 years moving weight through the most dangerous drug corridor in America. He had multiple narcotics convictions stretching back decades. He ran with the deadliest crew in East Harlem. And when Martin Scorsese immortalized him in Goodfellas as a stuttering punchline in the Bamboo Lounge,
Jimmy Two Times, he said everything twice.
I'm gonna go get the papers.
nobody asked the question that mattered. Who was this guy really? This is the story of how Hollywood turned a serious mobster into a joke, how Pleasant Avenue became America's heroin supermarket, and how the real Jimmy Two Times helped build one of the Lucchese family's most profitable operations while hiding in plain sight. From the French Connection to federal indictment, from Little Italy royalty to East Harlem's Purple Gang wars, this is the true story the movie never told. But here's what nobody understood. Johnny Echoes wasn't alone in that world. He was surrounded by killers. By the time Goodfellas hit theaters in 1990, the neighborhood Johnny grew up in had already drowned in blood. Johnny Echoes was born John Campopiano on August 13th, 1934, in East Harlem. Not just anywhere in East Harlem, Pleasant Avenue, 6 blocks between 114th Street and 120th Street. If you didn't grow up there, you didn't understand it. This was the heart of Italian Harlem. Old world rules, omertà, respect, and heroin. Lots of heroin. His father, Michel Campopiano, was a man of substance. He owned properties on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, real estate, legitimate business fronts. The kind of portfolio that gave a family weight in mob circles. Michel moved through Little Italy like he belonged there, because he did. The Campopiano name meant something. It meant connections. It meant money. It meant you didn't ask too many questions. John grew up watching, learning, understanding how things worked. On Pleasant Avenue, the rules were simple. You kept your mouth shut. You earned. And if you had a quirk, a stutter, a speech impediment that made you repeat yourself, you didn't let it stop you. You made it work. Because that's what Johnny Echoes had. A neurological tic that caused him to say everything twice.
I'm gonna go get the papers.
Not a stutter, not a joke, a speech pattern that became his signature. I'm gonna go get the papers. Get the papers. That line in Goodfellas, that was real. Henry Hill heard Johnny say things like that 1,000 times. Scorsese thought it was comedy gold. Johnny's associates thought it was just Johnny. By the time Johnny reached his 20s, East Harlem was changing. The old mustache petes, the Sicilian bosses who controlled the narcotics trade, were getting arrested. The French Connection was unraveling. In 1973, federal agents smashed one of the biggest heroin pipelines in American history. They arrested Lucchese boss Carmine Tramonti. They arrested Louis Haha Inglesi, a major Pleasant Avenue trafficker. They took down dozens of Italian-American mafiosi who had been importing heroin from Turkey through France and flooding it into Harlem. And that created a vacuum. Into that vacuum stepped a new generation, younger, hungrier, more violent. They called themselves the East Harlem Purple Gang. They were semi-independent from the 5 families, but they worked closely with the Lucchese family and later the Genovese family. They were Italian-Americans who grew up on Pleasant Avenue. They were related to made men. They were delivery boys and lookouts who graduated to wholesale distribution. And they were absolutely ruthless. Johnny Echoes wasn't a Purple Gang founder, but he ran in the same circles. He knew the same people. He worked the same blocks. While the Purple Gang specialized in contract killings and dismemberment, Johnny focused on what he did best, moving heroin, wholesale quantities, kilograms at a time. Here's how the operation worked. By the mid-1970s, Pleasant Avenue had become known in law enforcement as the Pleasant Avenue Connection. It replaced the French Connection. The neighborhood was a wholesale heroin market. Tenements lined the streets. Social clubs operated openly. Mob bosses like Anthony Salerno ran the Genovese family from Pleasant Avenue. Suppliers came from everywhere. Asian heroin, South American cocaine. The drugs flowed in. The money flowed out. Johnny Echoes was a middleman. He'd pick up packages from suppliers, sometimes Asian dealers, sometimes other mob associates. He'd distribute to street-level dealers, many of them African-American gangsters who controlled retail distribution in Harlem and the Bronx. The Purple Gang supplied Leroy Nicky Barnes, the most infamous black drug lord in Harlem. Barnes was moving heroin at $75,000 per kilogram. Johnny and guys like him were the pipeline that made it possible. The money was staggering. A single kilogram of heroin bought wholesale for $75,000 could be cut and resold for $300,000 or more on the street. Multiply that by dozens of kilos per month, and you're talking about millions flowing through Pleasant Avenue every year. Johnny didn't get rich. Soldiers rarely did. But he earned. He kept earning. And he stayed out of the spotlight. That's the key to understanding Johnny Echoes. He wasn't flashy. He didn't drive Cadillacs or wear expensive suits. He didn't open restaurants or buy nightclubs. He was a working mobster. A grinder. The kind of guy who showed up, did the job, collected his cut, and went home. The kind of guy law enforcement watched but couldn't quite nail. Until they could. Johnny's first narcotics arrest came early in his career, though the exact date is buried in sealed federal records. He was convicted. He did time. Then he came back and did it again. Because that's what guys like Johnny did. They didn't reform. They didn't retire. They went back to what they knew. In his case, that meant Pleasant Avenue. That meant heroin. That meant the life. By the time the 1980s rolled around, the East Harlem Purple Gang was disintegrating. Law enforcement pressure was intense. Murders were piling up. The gang had committed at least 17 homicides by 1977, according to police reports. Dozens more murders were suspected. Dismemberment became their trademark. .22 caliber firearms became their signature. Bodies turned up in car trunks, in dumpsters, in the Bronx. The violence was out of control. The Mafia started absorbing Purple Gang members into official crews. Some became made men. Angelo Prisco joined the Genovese family. Daniel Leo became acting boss of the Genovese family in 2005. The Purple Gang's remnants merged into the Genovese family's 116th Street crew. The independent gang was gone. But the drug trade wasn't. Johnny Echoes kept working. He was older now, in his 50s, in his 60s, but he was still connected, still earning, still part of the machine. And that's when Henry Hill entered the picture. Henry Hill was a Lucchese associate, not a made man because he was half Irish, but he was deeply embedded in the Lucchese family's operations throughout the 1960s and 70s. He knew everyone. He hung out at the Bamboo Lounge, a mob social club where Lucchese guys gathered. He saw the comings and goings. He heard the conversations, and he knew Johnny Echoes. Henry knew Johnny wasn't a joke. He knew Johnny moved heroin. He knew Johnny had convictions. He knew Johnny's father had weight in Little Italy. But when Henry told stories to Nicholas Pileggi for the book Wise Guy, and when Scorsese adapted it into Goodfellas, they focused on the quirk, the speech pattern, the comedic potential. Anthony Powers played Jimmy 2 times in the movie. He walks into the Bamboo Lounge. He says,
I'm going to go get the papers. Get the papers.
Everyone laughs. He's gone. That's the entire character. Audiences loved it. The line became iconic. People quoted it at parties. It became a meme before memes existed. But nobody asked who the real guy was. Nobody dug deeper. Because the movie wasn't about Johnny Echoes. It was about Henry, about Jimmy Conway, about Tommy DeVito. Johnny was background, flavor, a throwaway gag in a 3-hour masterpiece. But the real Johnny Echoes was still out there, still working, still moving product. On September 23rd, 1997, everything caught up with him. Federal agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration executed a massive operation targeting an aging crew of mobsters who were still dumping Asian heroin onto New York streets. They arrested 14 suspects. Among them was 73-year-old Albert Pucco, known as Uncle Albert, a grandfather and aging Lucchese associate. The operation had been running since the early 1970s, prosecutors claimed. Decades of distribution, millions of dollars, an entire network of older mobsters who refused to retire. Johnny's role in the 1997 bust isn't fully detailed in public records. Court documents refer to him as one of Pucco's alleged accomplices, but the specifics of his involvement remain murky. What's clear is that Johnny was still in the game, still connected, still part of a distribution network that had survived for over 20 years. The arraignment took place before Manhattan federal magistrate Ronald Ellis. Frank Catino was released on $100,000 bail. The others, including Johnny Echoes, were held pending bail hearings. The outcome of Johnny's case isn't documented in easily accessible records. Federal drug cases from that era often ended in plea deals, reduced sentences, or cooperation agreements that remained sealed. What we know is that Johnny Echoes eventually walked free. Jimmy 2 times became a joke. The real Johnny Echoes became invisible. Henry Hill knew who Johnny was. He knew the streets Johnny worked. He knew the weight Johnny carried. But when he told the story, he focused on the quirk, because that's what made good material. That's what audiences would remember. And he was right. 35 years later, people still quote that line. But they don't know the rest. They don't know that Pleasant Avenue was ground zero for heroin distribution in 1970s New York. They don't know that the Lucchese family controlled massive narcotics networks through guys like Johnny. They don't know that the East Harlem Purple Gang committed dozens of murders, some so brutal that dismemberment became their calling card. They don't know that Johnny's father owned properties in Little Italy, giving the family legitimate business fronts and mob connections. They don't know that Johnny was arrested multiple times, convicted multiple times, and kept coming back. They don't know any of it, because the movie didn't show it. That's the power of cinema. It shapes memory. It creates legends, and sometimes it erases the truth. Johnny Echoes lived 2 lives, one in reality, one on screen. The real Johnny moved heroin, survived federal busts, outlived most of his associates, and died at 84. The movie Jimmy 2 times became an icon, a meme, a cultural reference point that will outlive us all. But the two were never the same person. And that's what makes this story so fascinating, because Goodfellas is based on real events, real people, real crimes, but it's still a movie. It's still entertainment. And entertainment requires choices, what to show, what to hide, what to exaggerate, what to simplify. Scorsese chose to show the quirk. He chose to make audiences laugh. He chose to create a memorable character who appears for 30 seconds and lives forever in pop culture. And in doing so, he buried the real story of a mobster who spent decades in one of the most violent drug trades in American history. The irony is that Johnny probably didn't care. Guys like him didn't seek attention. They didn't want fame. They wanted to earn, stay out of prison, and survive. Johnny did all 3. He outlived the French Connection. He outlived the Purple Gang. He outlived the Pleasant Avenue Connection. He survived federal indictments and walked free. He lived to 84, dying peacefully in Putnam County, far from the violence that defined his world. That's more than most wise guys got. Tommy DeSimone, the real Tommy from Goodfellas, was murdered and buried in a shallow grave. Jimmy Burke, the real Jimmy Conway, died in prison. Henry Hill died in the Witness Protection Program, broke and bitter. But Johnny Echoes, he made it out. He survived, Maybe that's the real story. Not the laugh line, not the quirk, but the fact that a mid-level Lucchese soldier, working in the shadow of the deadliest gang in Harlem, managed to navigate 30 years of federal heat, gang violence, and mob paranoia, and still died of natural causes at 84. That takes skill. That takes luck. That takes knowing when to talk and when to shut up. And if you think about it, maybe that speech impediment helped. Maybe repeating everything twice made people underestimate him. Maybe it made him seem harmless, funny, non-threatening. Maybe Johnny Echoes used his quirk as camouflage. Or maybe he was just a guy with a neurological tic who happened to be good at moving heroin. Either way, the truth is more interesting than the joke. Because Jimmy Two Times wasn't a character. He was a man. John Campopiano, son of Michelle, a Pleasant Avenue kid who grew up in the heroin trade, survived the Purple Gang Wars, outlasted federal indictments, and died at 84 with his secrets intact. Goodfellas made him famous, but it also made him fiction, and the real Johnny Echoes disappeared behind the laughter. That's the cost of becoming a meme. You stop being human. You become a reference point, a punchline, a line people quote without knowing who you were, what you did, what you survived. And in the end, maybe that's exactly what Johnny wanted. Because the best mobsters are the ones you never really know. The ones who operate in the shadows. The ones who earn, survive, and disappear. The ones the movies get wrong. Jimmy Two Times wasn't a joke. He was a ghost. And ghosts don't leave evidence. They leave legends. And legends, as we know, are almost never true. But now you know the truth. The next time you watch Goodfellas and that scene comes on, the next time Jimmy Two Times walks into the Bamboo Lounge and says, "I'm going to go get the papers," remember this. That character is based on a man named John Campopiano, a Lucchese soldier, a convicted heroin dealer, a Pleasant Avenue survivor, a man who spent 30 years in one of the deadliest drug trades in America and lived to tell no tales. Because that's the real wise guy code. You don't tell tales. You don't seek fame. You earn. You survive. And when Hollywood turns you into a joke, you let them. Because jokes don't do time. Jokes don't get indicted. Jokes don't end up in witness protection. Johnny Echoes understood that, and he took it to his grave.